everybody, and you are very welcome to the next event in Bray Literary Festival. And I am delighted to be joined by three terrific writers this afternoon, Henrietta McKervey, Arlen McMonagle and Neil Hegarty for our LitFix session. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about each author before we get into the event. So Henrietta McKervey has published 4 novels. A Talented Man was published just this year. A psychological suspense set in 1938 about a disillusioned author and master forger who discovers an unknown sequel to Bram Stoker's classic Dracula. She also published the novels Violet Hill, The Heart of Everything, and What Becomes of Us. Henrietta has a Hennessy First Fiction Award and won the inaugural UCD Maeve Binchy Travel Award. She was born in Belfast and now lives in Dublin. Arlen McMonagle has written for radio and published 2 collections of short stories, Psychotic Episodes from Arlen House and Liar Liar from Wordonthestreet. He has also published 2 novels. Ithaca, his first novel, was published by Picador in 2017 as part of a 2-book deal, and his latest novel, Laura Cassidy's Walk of Fame, was published in March 2020. Arlen lives in Galway. Neil Hegarty grew up in Derry. His novels include The Jewel and Inch Levels, which was shortlisted for the Kerry Group Novel of the Year Award in 2017. Neil's non-fiction titles include Frost, That Was the Life That Was, a biography of David Frost, and The Story of Ireland, which accompanies the BBC television history of Ireland. Neil is a regular literary reviewer for the Irish Times and he lives in Dublin. So you're very welcome, guys.
Thank you.
So to start off this afternoon's event, just to give our viewers a flavour of your work, I'm just going to ask each of you to read and then we'll get into a discussion about your work. So Neil, could I ask you, please, if you wouldn't mind, to give us a flavour of The Jewel?
I'd be glad to. I thought I would read the prologue from The Jewel. The Jewel is the name of the novel, and it's the name of the painting at the heart of the novel, which was created by a Victorian painter. So I don't need to give you any more of the context. I can just plunge in. So this is London, 1839. The cloth was of linen. That choice had always been clear, and not white, but rather the colour of cream, of buttermilk, of good Scotch porridge. Not white. She flinched from the very thought of the harshness, the dishonesty of white. White was bridal, virginal, clean, unsullied, and she was none of those things. White would not do for the task she had in mind. The linen set out for inspection was tabby woven. So they told her, there at the counter of dark mahogany and shining glass that ran impressively the length of the shop. Bolts of cloth lined the walls in every colour, fabric, texture. It was not a term she had previously heard of or understood. Tabby woven, madam, the assistant said, and his companion, his superior evidently, nodded approvingly to the right. As strong as linen can be, madam. Irish linen, the other interjected. The best, madam. Look at the quality, he said. And he ran a clean, proud hand over the cloth that was both rough and smooth at the same time. Tabby woven, and she thought of a cat purring and stretching in luxury. It was a pleasant term, though, of course, the words hardly mattered. Fabric was the thing, and it would serve admirably. This was a day for adventure, beginning with the railway journey down from Watford. What an adventure, with the din and the steam of the train, and then Euston with its vast roofs and its great arch. Best to consider the adventure and the glamour of it all, and to ignore the smoke and the coal dust, the coal smuts filling the air, the dirt clinging to the nostrils and showing up horrifyingly on her handkerchief. Quite enough for one day, without London men to negotiate. The carriages raising a din of hooves and an explosion of dust with every passing, an odour of dirt and smoke and tobacco and horse ordure to be avoided on Kingsway as she pressed through the crowds, lifting her skirts just a polite little. feeling the sickness but holding it at bay, pressing London heat, preserve me from this dirt and this place. But she had a task, so she understood, waking in bed, feeling her illness anew, examining her skin for fresh sores and redness. Then in the train, then pushing through the crowds on the hot pavement, a something to accomplish and much to hold at bay, and then directly home. It will serve, she said now. It will serve, yes, very nicely indeed. And both of their faces lifted at this effort of sprightliness on her part. She saw with a pang that they too were tired, for all of their pride in this porridge-coloured piece of linen, these bolts of cloth from across the empire and across the world, the shining glass and glossy dark wood, the handsome shop. Excellent, madam, it will last you a lifetime. A tablecloth, he added, and he raised an interested eyebrow. No, indeed. And then to fend off further questions, I need 80 inches by 60 inches unhemmed, she said. And then she relented and essayed some humour. Not quite a tablecloth, gentlemen. An unhemmed tablecloth would be a very awkward tablecloth, she said. And now she took a step back in her mind and watched them rethink and recalibrate. Still well dressed, of course, still a lady, but an eccentric, probably. One of the swarms of eccentric ladies that people today's London. One reads about them in Blackwell's. Perhaps this young lady's plan is to fashion an eccentric something by her own hand, a shawl or a wrap, and parade the item as eccentric females like to do. And ought eccentric females be permitted to roam London all alone? Where's her husband? Does he know she's on the loose? Well, so be it. It was still good Irish linen, a pretty penny. They could still be pleased with the sale. Indeed, the first man said. No, I'm going to paint on it, she heard herself say. A polite pause and then, indeed, madam. She nodded, and now, for the first time today, the deed virtually done, the purchase virtually complete, the journey worth it after all, she felt a small pulse of pleasure and anticipation. Yes, she said, I'm going to paint on it. It will be my best piece. The man nodded, smiled. They had nothing else to say. It will be my best piece. The linen was stretched on a frame now, and it was sized, the glue heated and applied rapidly. It was ready. The water and the pigments were ready also, and set out in their neat little dishes. Cinnabar and lead white, azurite, ultramarine, verdigris and smalt and beautiful, profound malachite. She would prepare the distemper, batch by batch. The colours would blaze if she had anything to do with it, and leap from the cloth, and live, and breathe. They would never be seen, but this was the very least of her worries. Later, much later, days later, for the plan to begin and conclude this painting in less than no time, to execute it in a flash with one eye on the sands of her life running rapidly, this plan came to nothing. It had to be done correctly. It had to be done with love and pride. How foolish she had been even to think of dashing this piece off in a trice. Later she could step back and see this blazing and leaping for herself. The tiny sparks of brilliant white and the cinnabar and the verdigris, yes, they were intense, they blazed as though alive. The malachite at the centre of all breathed and inhaled and exhaled with life. The distemper, colour by colour, had soaked through the linen, as she'd intended it should. The fabric now was heavy and sodden. But it would dry, and it would be rolled away, and she would leave her instructions to the letter, and they would be carried out when the time came. She looked again. Yes, the smooth, dark horse haunch, the jewel embedded in the gleaming pauldron, blazing out as she'd wanted it to, the malachite shining as though lit from within. There it was, placed at the very centre of the piece, and the light welled from it. It was a living thing. It would live forever. It would live when she was dead. It would shine and swell in the darkness. She thought again about the men, the kindly, confused men who had sold her the linen. What would they have said? And now she reframed the conversation in her head. Not a tablecloth, on no account. I mean to paint on it in distemper. A thin brush, gentlemen, is best with this medium. Many, many layers quickly applied. The distemper will soak and saturate, and then it will dry and be complete. And I mean the colours to sing. Malachite and cinnabar and indigo and azurite. The most beautiful words, the most beautiful colours my means can command. Distemper, gentlemen, it fades very rapidly indeed. We have few such pieces alive in the world, but I mean this piece to live forever, as I will not. No, you see, I mean to have this piece placed upon me as a coverlet when I am in my coffin, placed carefully and carefully tucked and smoothed. A shroud? By no means, gentlemen. I would not care to be wrapped in such a biblical way. How primitive that would be, and how confining. No, I mean a rug, a covering, a coverlet, to keep me warm and keep me cool for all eternity. A coverlet and a painting that will live forever, through the ages, in the darkness. Yes, indeed it has a name, a good name. You will approve, gentlemen, I am certain. Would you like to hear it? Very well then, I shall tell you the name. I shall call it the Jewel. Thanks.
Beautiful introduction there, Neil. Thank you very much. And I think it was a very apt piece to read as well, the prologue, because it is Emily who is at the heart of this book. And it's Emily's painting, The Jewel, who brings about the connection between the three main characters, which we will get into in a few minutes after we've heard the other readings. So Henrietta, could I invite you please to give us a taste of a talented man?
Sure. Yeah, we're still in London. I'm 99 years after Neil, though. It's January 1938 here. And it's interesting hearing, Neil, the beautiful colours that come to life in his reading. It's just amazing. And he and I have talked about this before, that he has this amazing colour palette, and I really have three colours. The talented man with three colours. They're quite different, yeah. Anyway, so it's 1938, and Ellis Spender lives with his mother, Virginia. His father was a famous society painter, Sydney. He's dead. And the two of them live in shabby gentry, really, in North London. They have very little family money, but they have a massive house. And they have been reduced to taking in lodgers, even though his mother won't use the word, but they have these two paying guests in order to help make ends meet. Their other problem is that Virginia's brother Freddie, who's a theatrical impresario and friend of the Stokers, has recently fled to New York from London, leaving them all his debts and most of his belongings. And Ellis found a way to earn a quid for himself by selling back some letters Freddie received from a man who would now like them back because they're rather compromising. So Ellis has decided at least he can find those, sell them, and he'll make a few quid. So he's on his way to do this. A large room at the back of the house with waist-height wood panelling and porch-coloured wallpaper on three walls. It had been the music room before becoming Sydney's studio, though the grand piano that once sat in the wide glass-paned bay window which bulged out over the back garden was long gone. Above the picture rail, the paper was beginning to slough off here and there, thinly, as the skin of a cooked chicken might pull from the flesh. Years before, when Virginia had a reputation for hosting extravagant suppers after Freddie's first nights or Sydney's exhibition openings, she would have the Persian rugs taken up for dancing. The room would become stuffy with smoke and loud during those evenings, layer upon layer of babble and laughter. Ellis used to imagine the press of people pushing against the walls, forcing the glass bay further into its bulbous shape, stretching and straining it until the frame was exhausted and the glass ready to explode. When Nanny finally dozed off by the nursery hearth, he would sneak downstairs and appear at his mother's side. Too early, and he'd be packed off upstairs again with the humiliating sting of a fresh slap from Sydney across the back of his legs. But if he timed it right, he'd be petted and fussed over like a lapdog, delicious morsels dropping into his mouth from the guests' very own plates. In the morning, the smells, stale cigars, a sour fruitiness he later learned was spilt champagne, The rich hint of the roast beef and horseradish sandwiches Virginia insisted were served in the hour before the party finished would gradually dissipate, overcome by freshly lit fires, lavender and beeswax, as day sluiced away night. During the war, when commissions dried up and Sidney's assistants, Max and Roderick, enlisted, Max was bayoneted on the second day of the Somme. Roderick died in a mustard gas attack a year later, his skin blistered and unrecognisable. Neither had a funeral, they had merely ceased to exist. Sidney gave up the studio in Mayfair he kept for 20 years, moving its contents into the music room. Until the arrival of Freddie's parcelled up life, the room had remained pretty much as Sidney had left it. Sidney's father George had bought number 9 Fitzroy Gardens, newly built in 1868. When Sidney inherited it in 1897, he changed nothing. Neither did Virginia when Sidney died a quarter of a century later. Built to be run by a silently efficient staff moving to and from the basement, as if appearing and disappearing into an automaton clock, the house had sunk into itself in the absence of such labour. Relentlessly fashionable by the standards of the previous century, to Ellis it was like living in a museum. It was a mortuary of stuffed birds trapped under glass domes, of Odinil paint and ornaments, of knee-banging tables that buckled under the weight of potted plants. The furniture was dark, the fabrics thickly woven prints of birds and ferns, the wallpapers complex trellises of leaves and flowers, threaded through with tiny creatures. He was an explorer in his own home, wandering lost through endless foliage, every movement followed by hidden eyes. The ancient brass heater he'd switched on in the music room before breakfast hadn't made any noticeable impression on the temperature of the room, merely sending tears of condensation down the windows. Ellis wiped a couple of panes. It was another sunless morning, and the room was washed in the same grey light as the wrung-out clouds over Hampstead Heath. An odour of mice was joined by the scent of warming dust. He checked the door was shut, then made a start on Freddie's boxes. It was sure to take no time at all, though he had decided to leave Winsome to sweat it out for a few days. Not only would that make his fee appear well earned, but he knew Winsome's worry would slowly spread inside him, a contagion building in his blood. How much consideration had Winsome given, he wondered, to the knowledge that success in retrieving his ill-considered correspondence meant that Ellis would learn the contents of the letters. He began happily enough, confident that what he wanted would be waiting, ready to be found, trilling, "Cooey, over here." The sensation was almost enjoyable, like playing a game he had already won. But within minutes his light-heartedness was dissipating. Container after container, box after box, it was chaos. Books, programmes, letters, scribbled scraps of paper, diaries, everything thrown in together with no attempt at establishing order by date or subject. Freddie wasn't the only designer of this pandemonium, he knew, briefly regretting his decision to hire a penny-pitching firm of navvies when Virginia had begged him to organise the urgent packing and removal of his uncle's possessions. Ellis regarded the junk stacked up around him. What a waste of £310. Winsome aside, nothing there was worth a jot. He denied, of course, but Ellis was sure Freddie was well aware of the debts he abandoned when he left for New York, confident that Virginia would bail him out. Either that or what he'd said in his note to Ellis was truth rather than bluster. He didn't care what happened to his possessions. Though Ellis believed the two events were as linked as if roped together, Virginia drew no connection between Freddie's near bankruptcy and his decision to stay in America. Freddie had no intention of returning to London, which made the waste of money in redeeming his possessions even more galling. Virginia hadn't paid a down payment on his return, just the laundry bill for clearing up the mess he left when he vacated their lives. Why could she never be angry with her brother? Why was she so blind to who, to what he was? Freddie's departure had left his mother lonely and upset in a way Ellis had never seen before, not even when his father died. By her curious logic, the prospect of becoming a widow was always a reasonable expectation for a woman who marries a man 20 years her senior. In fact, it was preferable. Virginia couldn't bear the idea of going before her husband. It was sad, yes, but knowable. Not tragic, not shocking. Her husband was dead. There was no grief, but no rage or railing against cruel fate. Within half an hour, he was ready to give up the whole business. It was ridiculous. He kicked a box in anger, and its paper entrails gushed out, streaming across the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. It gives a great idea of Ellis and his situation as well. And so now from Victorian London to Galway 2020, Arlen McMonagle, Laura Cassidy's Walk of Fame.
Thanks very much, Tanya. Hi, Neil. Hi, Henrietta. Lovely to be here with you this afternoon. Yeah, not only are we moving out of London to a big town come small city on the west coast of Ireland, and we're going to further reduce the colour palette. The particular budding actress in the narrator of this particular narrative, she lives very much in the world of monochrome. Black and white movies are her go-to, very much so. For the reading, I think I'll just read to provide a flavour of Laura, both as a young girl, gifted, if you like, with a dream to pursue, and then a little bit from the second chapter, when we see her early into adulthood and how she is faring out. From the get-go then. Someday you're going to be a star. Your name is going to be written in bright and dancing lights. Mark my words, Daddy said. People will see your face and smile. Speak memorable lines from the movies you appear in. A legend in your time, that's what you will be, Daddy said. And I was happy to hear him say it. At that hour, it was just the two of us. We had just finished watching the late night movie together, and Daddy was keen to hear my thoughts. I wasn't slow giving him my verdicts. Sunset Boulevard, best movie ever. When I grow up, I'm going to be Norma Desmond. The Big Sleep. Don't ask me what was going on, but I loved it. The postman always rings twice. Great story, but no way would I end up in a jam like that. In a Lonely Place, Gloria Graham, so good. I lost count of how many movies Daddy and me watched. Mother and Jennifer and everyone else on the street were in bed, and I only wanted to watch them with him, and with the lights out. That way no one could interrupt us with stupid questions like, what's with the mysterious woman? Or why is that fellow so obsessed? Or could they switch the channel because they were fed up? I never got fed up. Damsels in distress movies with moody strangers who came to the rescue. Dark and grainy and hard to figure out what was happening movies with men that were all the time looking for something. Women that were too good to be true. And storylines that would bring them fleetingly together before they were ripped apart from each other forever. Film noir, as Daddy called those ones. They Live by Night, Kiss Tomorrow Goodbye, The Asphalt Jungle, Laura. I loved watching that one because I thought it had been named after me. It's the other way around, silly, Daddy said when I asked him, and then offered me that half smile of his that he saved for whenever I'd said something clever. Until the night of the accident, I used to watch films with Daddy all the time. He knew everything about them, all the actors and who made the film and when the film was made. That film is older than me and you put together, he'd say. He knew all the lines and loved rewatching his favorites. I was convinced he must have seen all the movies ever made. What are we watching tonight? I'd ask him. To Have and Have Not, he said, patting the cushion and beckoning me onto the sofa beside him, while checking the guide to make sure. Bogart and Bacall are on this one. Wait until you see this pair go. It's nearly as good as the Maltese Falcon. Bogart is in that one too, I said, remembering. The stuff that dreams are made of, Daddy said, and I figured that must be another movie line. Daddy let me stay up later and later, watch whatever was on. I saw Alan Ladd and Veronica Lake in everything they were in together. Every man has seen you somewhere, Alan tells Veronica. The trick is to find you. Veronica smiled her coy smile, and later I tried to do my hair in the peekaboo style she wore. I watched Barbara Stanwyck run rings around Fred McMurray in Double Indemnity. You're not smarter, Walter, you're just a little taller. Lana Turner did the same to John Garfield, Lauren Bacall gave Bogart as good as she got, and Gloria Swanson gives William Holden a lot more than he bargained for. Watch out, here comes Jane Greer, Daddy said one night. She is going to stop Robert Mitchum dead in his tracks, and believe me when I say it, if she can stop Mitchum, she can stop any man. I could never wait to do my newest productions for him. Encore, encore, Daddy bellowed every time I did my finish-up bow and courtesy. And Daddy was the last person I was going to disappoint. And so I did my little acts all over again, start to finish, tweaking them here and there for extra effect. And he was off. Stardom, shining lights, my name along the Walk of Fame. He asked me did I know what the Walk of Fame was, and I shook my head, and he smiled and cleared his throat and told me all about the famous Boulevard in Hollywood and the 2,500 stars along it, every one of them named after someone from the world of movies. It goes on for over a mile, and everyone you can think of is there, Daddy said. Marilyn Monroe is there, and Marlene Dietrich, Joan Crawford, she's there, and so is Betty Davis, and Greta Garbo, the greatest of them all. And when the time comes, you'll be next. They are going to put your name on a star for everyone to see. And do you know what that means, he asked, and again I shook my head. Immortality, Daddy said, with a quiver in his voice. That's what it means. And then he hauled me outside the front door of our house, not stopping until we had crossed the road, past the boathouse, and were standing side by side in the chill of night on Nimmo's pier. Look, he said, hunkering down beside me and pointing to the blurry lights along the pier. Can you see it? Hollywood, starry lights, the Walk of Fame. Just you wait, Laura. One day it will be your turn, he said. Then he stretched out his arm, and with the penknife fetched out of his pocket, he scratched into the pier wall the words, "A star is born." I wasn't going to disagree with him, and I could see it, could see myself up there on the silver screen, effortlessly jousting with my co-stars, moving with serene calm through my scenes, gliding with slick abandon into my close-up. Come opening night, I saw myself taking to the red carpet, the snap-happy photographers, the screaming fans, the journalists shoving their mics in my face, eager for my words. Come award season, I heard my name called out at every prize giving in the land. At parties, I was an extraordinary person, brilliant and illuminating. Wherever I went, everybody wanted a piece of me. They couldn't wait to announce my name. From an early age, that was me then. Laura Cassidy, the movie world's leading light, star of the silver screen. Isn't that right, Laura? Yes, it is, Laura. Indeed, it is. So far, things haven't panned out as Daddy and me had foreseen. My name hasn't even left the ground, let alone appeared in shining lights. Adulation and fame have offered themselves as little more than a woebegone squawk. There is still time, though. That's what I tell myself every day when I wake up, ready and eager to offer myself to the waiting world. After all, I am not long past my 25th birthday, a mere child according to one or two of Mother's friends. Remember what Daddy said, I remind myself, when it all threatens to get away from me. The world is a place of possibilities, a place containing moments set aside just for you. There are several small reasons and one or two big reasons that have delayed my progress. Among the small reasons has been the lack of parts befitting someone of my talents, hold-ups with the construction of the new theatre, and the outgoing director in our town. His name is Mitchell. But for some time now, I have been referring to him as the imbecile. The imbecile who wouldn't know how to direct traffic. The imbecile who seems to have a huge amount of trouble recognizing genuine talent when it is standing in front of him. The imbecile who would only know an actress if she wriggled her ripe rump in its face and said her name was Zsa Zsa Gabor, the big reasons I try not to think about. Because sometimes, and by sometimes I mean all the time, I think it is the little things, Mitchell the imbecile is a good example, that cause all the trouble. It is not heart attacks or machetes or remote-controlled bombs that zap the life out of a person. It's the way people look at you and laugh, think they are always a step ahead. That's what I told them during my brief stint in St. Jude's when invited to share something with the group. So many people, so few bullets. That's something else I said, and they laughed. The scourge of the street, mother calls me when I am in this kind of mood. I am not the scourge of the street, I am fast to reply. I am the most dangerous person in the country. I'll leave it at that.
Thanks very much, Alan. Again, it gives us a great idea of Laura and her plight. And just when I was thinking about the three novels, they're all very character-driven books. And something popped into my head, John Fowles' classic novel, The Collector, which is about a guy who collects butterflies and becomes obsessed with this woman and kidnaps her. And there's one line in that particular novel that says everything about the character's actions. And it goes something like, my father died in a truck accident when I was 2 years of age, and my mother abandoned me shortly thereafter. And I was thinking of this in relation to all of your novels, guys, because backstory and upbringing are very, very important to all of your characters. And Neil, I'd like to start with you on this one, if you don't mind. So you've got three protagonists in your novel, and just to mention who they are, we have John, who is the art thief, and he's also a bitter and disillusioned artist. Then we have Roisin, who is kind of the lone figure, and she is the gallery curator. And then we have Ward, who's in an abusive gay relationship, and he's an art historian charged with the responsibility of recovering the stolen painting. But when we think about all of your characters, so when we think about Laura Cassidy, when we think about Ellis, they're all quite damaged and vulnerable characters in their own way. And Neil, would you like to maybe just start off by saying, because the reason I picked you out first there was because a lot of the jewel is backstory. We find out an awful lot about the characters and where they've come from, before any of the theft with the painting happens.
Yeah, absolutely. You can't understand any of the context surrounding the theft and what happens after the theft without taking into account the three principal characters and, as you say, their backstory. The thing I was particularly interested in exploring in this book was what happens when you have a moment of crisis or of rupture in your life, especially in your early life. Everything is ticking along as a child or as a young person, then something happens. In my mind, I imagine it as a fracture. Sometimes that fracture heals and it heals well and you carry on. Sometimes it doesn't heal so well and you feel that the sort of residual pain for the rest of your life. And of course, then sometimes it doesn't heal at all. And I was interested in exploring that moment of fracture in three individual lives. I won't say what those fractures consist of, in case anybody hasn't read the book. And then tracing the trajectory of those lives as a result of that moment of crisis. And it's something that I think that everybody can identify with up to a point. There isn't any such thing as a kind of golden childhood or some rose-tinted childhood. Something happens in all of our lives. It's a common thing. The question is, how do you get back onto an even keel again? And if you don't get back onto an even keel, what does that do to the tone and the tenor of the rest of your life? And it's interesting to hear Henrietta and Alan read too, because there is the same sense of a grain running through each of these three books, which is it's very interesting to see that work in other writers.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that brings us perfectly to Alan McMonagle there, Neil, just talking about that fracture. Because, you know, there is this huge fracture, Alan, in Laura's life. You know, she's been very, very close to her father as a child. That piece demonstrated it there that you read. You know, she sat up late at night watching all these old movies with her dad, and this created an incredibly close bond between them. And so then when this horrific incident happens, which is not spoiling, I hope, Alan, in any way, because it is what the book is about. I think it's really at the heart and soul of the book. It's when Laura's dad drowns when she's only 12 years old. And that creates the fracture, as Neil put it, in Laura's life.
Yeah. And
it's interesting because Laura and her sister Jennifer appear to deal with this in completely different ways. Yeah. For Laura, she just never seems to quite get beyond that.
Yeah. Definitely the two siblings, Laura, Jennifer, I think they initially they appear to deal with it in different ways. I think it's you've more or less mentioned the details. Yeah, she loses her father when she's 12, coastal accident. It's tragic. There's a couple of other things around that I'd probably like to say. Is that and again, I don't think it's spoiling anything, but Laura witnesses the accident, the tragedy, and it's also in addition to it happening at a crucial age in her life, it's actually a crucial moment in her life as well. It's at a time when she's hurrying out to meet him. This is one of their meeting places. It's the pier again. It gets referenced in the excerpt that I've read. It's one of these touchstone places for her, one of her go-to places in her stomping ground. But she's hurrying out to see him, full of excitement, because she's just bagged her first role, her first prominent role in the school play. For any 12-year-old, I think that would be a pretty big deal. And she's obviously the first person she wants to share this news with. And then lo and behold, he is taken from her. So I think when we meet, when we jump ahead quite quickly into Laura's, quite early into her adulthood, she is already, there's already a heady cocktail, I think, simmering away inside her. And that's, that includes a lot of things. I think, trauma, grief, but I think also little bits of guilt and fear and probably denial. And I don't think she's quite aware of the extent of this cocktail. And I don't think she is going to be able to predict or anticipate how and when this cocktail is going to flare up and rear its ugly head. And I certainly don't think she's going to be able to control how it evinces itself. And so again, a word Neil has already used. So she is really setting herself up for a crisis, which will come quite early on also, when she does manage to get an early role in the theatre, a supporting role in a play. And again, she's, it's on the evening itself, opening night, it's going to hit her in ways that sadly that she can't anticipate or predict, because of what this tragedy has done to her, vis-a-vis this close bond that she has with her father. I mean, he has planted this dream, this dream of stardom, of this theatre acting ambition in her from a very, very young age, and this has become part of her fabric. It's really all she has and all she is. And from the age of 12, with this tragedy that she witnesses, it's really all she becomes. And I think it sets her on a journey, but it's an inner journey inside herself, which brings me around to Jennifer, the elder sibling, who gets to fly the coop, if you like. She gets out into the big world, ostensibly as some sort of a do-gooder. She takes herself off to some of the lesser well-off countries in the world, all in the service of helping out, doing good deeds, and so forth. But I think also this is possibly her way of dealing with the trauma, which she also has experienced as well, possibly to a lesser extent of Laura, who actually witnesses it. Yeah, I think when we meet Laura, there's a gap between there's a huge gap between where she is and where she would like to be, and it's that gap that's going to provide her with solace and refuge, but also potentially disappointment, setback, and ultimately a lot of heartache. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thanks very much, Alan. And it is interesting because, obviously Laura is the central character, but when we think about Jennifer's character, as you say, maybe this is just, she's got a different way of dealing with the grief,
Yeah.
She takes flight, she throws herself into this humanitarian aid work.
That's right.
The way Laura sees it is she thinks, oh, she's kind of the perfect sister. But maybe this is her way of escaping by throwing herself into helping other people as well. And she's got her own difficulties to bear too. There's the disappeared partner and all this. So really, her life is not as perfect as Laura seems to think.
Yeah, far from it. I think you're exactly right. And Laura can't help but have a deep suspicion for her sister. I mean, she's been away for a long time also. And all of a sudden she rocks up with a young, a little Juan, a young boy to boot. And what's been going on, where did little Juan come from? Where's his father? What does he do? What has she really been getting up to? And Laura just feeds off all of this all the time as well. It's, it's part of this gap that I just alluded to. I mean, that within that gap it's a huge place of imagination and invention and secrecy for Laura. It's and really anything goes. And so I guess we're in the realm of the classical that classical thing, the unreliable narrator. And we're receiving Laura's impression and perceptions of Jennifer. But yeah, I think Jennifer has her own stuff to get through as well.
Yeah, great. Yeah. So as we can hear, the background is highly important here. It's that thing that you can never escape your past, which is so important in both those novels. So Henrietta, moving to A Talented Man and to your character of Ellis, it may not be quite as apparent as it is in Alan's and Neil's, but I'm still pretty sure that the backstory of Ellis is just as important in his formation as a character. And I know I'm not the first person to mention the talented Mr. Ripley. You might be sick of hearing about it by now, Henrietta, but it did jump out as soon as I started reading your book, and I imagine you were paying homage to Patricia Highsmith in your title, The Talented Man, as well. So he is different from Ripley in many ways, but the same type of psychotic character, whereas Ripley was from a poor background and he didn't have a lot of education and he was kind of aspiring to become somebody. For Ellis, it's almost the opposite, because as you mentioned, he was from a wealthy family. They were a society family in the past. They've come down in the world. You mentioned that they have the two lodgers that they've taken in order to kind of bring money in. So Ellis seems to, even though they have come down in the world, he seems to have this sense of entitlement. He feels that he should be somebody. He's a frustrated writer, which we'll get more into later, guys. But he feels that he should be receiving more recognition. And so this is kind of the driving force behind his actions, isn't it?
Yeah, it's interesting to hear Alan talk about that idea of the gap, because the gap with Ellis, he starts at the beginning of the book by only understanding the gap as between him and financial success. He believes he is a world-class author, and he doesn't understand why nobody has recognized this yet, but he's waiting for them to.
Oh, Henrietta.
So his frustrations aren't with his own abilities. his frustrations are with his own lack of financial success primarily, and other people's inability to understand his ability. So, and that as that gap widens for him, and we see as he tries to close it, he's actually making it much, much wider, because the things he ends up doing to try and create that success push him even further from what the rest of us would ever consider as in anything in the realm of acceptable behavior, you know. So actually in trying to close it, he's actually pushing himself much further from other people, which in itself plays into what Neil was talking about, that fracture, which I think is a lovely way of thinking about it. It's not a word I'd thought of for that before, about that thing that happened. And what happened to Ellis, and I won't say too much about it because it would be a spoiler, is that the thing that most affected him as a child, that he was never able to get onto an even keel from, isn't something he could even articulate. Mm-hmm. His generation, his age, that class, they didn't have the proper language even for what has happened to him. So that is itself forcing this other space between him, and that is something that he doesn't set out intending to resolve, but actually manages to towards the end of the book. And some of those elements were actually quite deliberate in the Talent of Mr. Ripley homage, which you're right. I mean, I think Ripley is an incredible character, and I was always so taken by how much you like him as a character. He does awful things. He thinks awful things. He's clearly terrible, and you still find yourself going, oh, please get, you know, you just want him to succeed all the time. And that was the challenge I gave myself with the book. Can you actually create a character who's appalling, like does the most obscene things and thinks nothing of killing? So, you know, but then I want the reader to be sitting there kind of disliking themselves for, but also hoping it all works out for him. So that was the thing about Ripley that I thought was so amazing, that I wanted to
see if I have to enjoy you, Henrietta, or I have to ask you, did you enjoy that aspect of writing Ellis?
Oh, absolutely.
Writing a character that was so utterly, completely different to yourself.
Yeah, completely. And also you have to make him, I mean, that's where that idea, that fracture comes in. You have to give him things that people can sympathize with, if not empathize with, but sympathize with, that they can see, okay, I think what you did is still appalling, but I can understand why you're so broken. That would set you off on this crazy path that, you know, wouldn't not the same way it might for the rest of us, but we can understand the seed point, if you like, where that began. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, yeah. And one of the things, of course, that struck me, you know, when I was preparing for this interview, was the fact that the arts play such an important role in all three books. So, for example, Neil, in your case, obviously it's fine art. Henrietta, in yours, it's literature, going back to Bram Stoker. And Alan, for you, it's film noir. And I know, Alan, you're a huge fan of noir. And I'm just thinking in terms of the impetus and the inspiration behind the book, what exactly was your starting point? Did you think to yourself, I'm going to write a book where I can incorporate this great passion of mine for old movies? Was that kind of the springboard?
It might have been. It was certainly thereabouts. In the beginning tar of the book, I think. I mean, for me, always that very initial thing, you've already mentioned it's voice, and the voice becomes a character, and the voice acquires, you know, flesh and blood and limbs and a mind. And I realized, that I did have a character who had a great grow for early cinema. In particular, that era of film noir from the 1940s and 1950s. And I had had a lot of fun coming up with making lists of femme fatales and their, tough talking wise guys, and writing and just trying to replicate the atmosphere of these films. I actually, I watched and or rewatched an awful lot of those old movies. Once I was into the thrust of the narrative, I even counted them at one point. There are 46 film noirs that get at least name checked in the novel, and I watched all of those, at least once while I was doing the book. Had a lot of fun doing that. But we sort of started cobbling together a certain feel. Like I would pick some of the great actresses, the Gloria Swansons, the Lana Turners, Barbara Stanwicks, the Lauren Bacalls, and I would I have to thank my editor Ansa for this. We sort of came up with this sort of top trumps type idea to write maybe make lists of bio notes for each of these actors and include all their best features, all their awards, any unusual characteristics, and we'd sort of pit them off against each other. I think we had 15 compiled at one point, but 5 ended up making the cut into the book, and the book is sort of divided up into 5 sections, each of them headed up by one of these 5 key bios, if you like. So I had great fun, but a tough job whittling it. 15, well, it was more than 15 at one point, but 15 eventually became 5, and that 5 key actresses, aka femme fatales from that era that Laura, the character, would hero worship. So all of that sort of came into play quite early on. I mean, I even replicated the conditions that I've described in the book. I mean, I would watch the films late at night, usually by myself with the lights out, and made some new discoveries and reminded myself of misspent youth and all of that, and staying up when I shouldn't have been. It was a lot of fun doing that, but I always liked the atmosphere of those movies, and I loved the language. I was lucky enough to get to see them at a very, very young age. I just loved the interactions between the men and the women. And I loved that no matter who it was, they all, the guys were tough talking, but the women gave it at least as good as they got. And I loved that every time a pair of characters said hello to each other, one of them always seemed to come off second best. I could never figure out why. It was something that I felt long before I understood it, but that was good enough, and the way they just used to interact.
It's interesting because your focus is on the femme fatales in these movies, because this is how Laura sees herself as the next big femme fatale.
Yeah. I mean, I think she admired these people, and the particular actresses that are chosen and get referenced and misquoted. They were all both on screen and off screen. I mean, they were path makers themselves. I mean, Barbara Stanwyck was a fabulous person. She was a fabulous actress, but even off screen as well. I mean, she was well able to stand up to these movie moguls and the Harvey Weinsteins, if you like, of her time, and really, not take anything from them, which was quite, I'm sure that would have been, back in the day, that was even tougher. Bad and all as things have been recently with all this breaking news and so forth. But and I like to think that Laura, this is the kind of woman that Laura would certainly have had a lot of time for and aspired to be, acting and beyond. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Great, thanks, Alan. Because I was thinking very much about the fact that you love these sort of movies when I was reading the book. I thought Alan is getting to indulge another passion here. So Neil, I'll go to you next about fine art. I was reading your interview before with the Gloss magazine with Sophie Grenham, and you were talking about how you sort of were almost presented in one go with the idea for the novel The Jewel, that you were on a bus and you were reading about the Beyond Caravaggio exhibition, and you started thinking about how they were going to keep these paintings safe and secure. Would you like to just talk to us about that?
Yeah, well, for some years I lived not far from the National Gallery of Ireland. And I developed this habit of cutting through the building on my way into the city centre. So in through Marion Square out to Clare Street. And I started looking at the paintings, stopping for 2 minutes, 5 minutes. And one of the paintings, of course, that everybody looks at in that building is the Irish Caravaggio, The Taking of Christ. So I was on a bus from Derry to Dublin, and I was reading a review of the sort of blockbuster Caravaggio exhibition, which had opened in London, was coming to Dublin, then was going on to Washington. This was a big, enormous, glittering exhibition. And I began to wonder how easy it would be to steal one of these paintings, how terrible a job it must be trying to organise the security for all these paintings travelling all over the world. And as I was sitting on the bus, that's where the first little germ of the idea came. I thought, well, what would happen if a painting, a valuable painting, a glittering painting, an extremely famous painting was stolen? How would it happen? What would happen as a result of that? And what would be the scenario that would lead up to this theft? And it's an interesting one for me to look back on now, because I can say that the beginning and the ending and much of the middle of the book was more or less fixed in my head by the time I got off the bus. Now, it's only a 2-hour journey, but it was like a gleam of light just suddenly fell into my lap, and I thought, yeah, okay, I think I know where I'm going with this book, to the extent that I had to tell my agent the next day that the book I had been working on, the book that I was in the middle of, I was going to have to set aside, because this other book, this other as yet non-existent book, was just demanding to be written, and it was a thrill. It was a great feeling. I hope I have many more such feelings as the years go on. But it's very interesting to remember that sometimes all you have to do is to be open, is to be aware of ideas coming in, and one will suddenly come in, and there's your next book or the book after that. All you need really is a piece of paper and a pen to start jotting things down frantically before you forget them again. It was a great feeling. I'll never forget it.
Yeah. Okay, and that, thanks, Neil. That brings me to Henrietta, and talking about getting various things and bringing them together. Henrietta, I was reading about your methodology on writing.ie, and I was intrigued to hear that you've got a folder where you just, it's like a goodie bag where you put all these interesting snippets, so as you come upon them, and you said sometimes you then take them back out and you start looking at them and think, could I match up some of these ideas to come up with a story? And so I was just reading about some of the things that led to you writing A Talented Man. So one, I believe, was an article about Florence Balcombe. And you actually had just decided, because it was Florence Lemon Balcombe, and because you got interesting names, that went into the folder. So that was one of the pieces of the jigsaw. And then you'd read a Guardian article about a previously unknown Edith Wharton play that had been revealed. And then the third piece of the jigsaw was a failed auction of the only surviving manuscript of Dracula. And so these three pieces came together to form the idea for A Talented Man.
Yeah, and I think they were sort of, sometimes something can be rattling around in your head, and which is why I keep that little folder, which is I call pieces of string too short to use, which is what all of these things are. And Florence Balcombe was a really interesting woman. I mean, it was all thanks to her that Bram Stoker's work that we know about Dracula. He didn't sell particularly well in his own lifetime. He never got the acclaim he felt he deserved. And it was all thanks to her for going after principles of copyright. She worked so hard that I was really intrigued by that she seemed to be, after his death, quite a different person to the person she'd been assumed to be in his lifetime. And I thought that was really interesting, but I didn't want to write her biography. I have a sort of biographical squeamishness about writing about real people to that extent. So yeah. I didn't want to do that. And then I was really intrigued by the idea that we hear there's just enough of a drip feed of new discoveries of old material to make me think that forging doesn't seem such an unlikely thing. I know it's the very big scale, like the Hitler diary forgeries, Lee Israel's, forging of all of those letters. So there is just enough of them that you can think, well, somebody would try and get away with it. There's just enough of that going on. And also that idea of the concept of, well, what is originality anyway? And that was one thing I was thinking, but I'm sure as writers, you all think the same. Sometimes you're sitting there thinking, not only do I not have an original way of expressing this, I'm not even sure it's an original thought, So you have to sort of try and deal with that, which I was quite interested in really looking at. Why does originality matter quite so much? Why can an exquisite forgery is also an original, so that's sort of genuine and original, authentic. And I thought it was really interesting just to look at all of those things. And then when I came across that piece about the manuscript of Dracula being found, it was in a barn in rural Pennsylvania in the 80s. Nobody knows how it got there. It was put up for auction and it didn't sell. There was no interest in it in the 80s. Apparently later, Paul Allen, the Microsoft co-founder, subsequently bought it, but there was no interest in it when it went up for auction. So at that time, people, people weren't interested in originality then. So I thought it was quite interesting, the idea of how interest comes and goes in this. And then what happens if somebody decides, right, I can be that dead person, I can replicate them.
Yeah, and it is fascinating. It's a fascinating idea. I mean, Ellis's journey kind of begins when he realizes that he's good at forging signatures.
Yeah.
And when he discovers that he can actually get away with this.
Yeah. And also for practical purposes, Florence Stoker had to be dead. Because, in real life, somebody who appeared with a manuscript, she would have been all over it and the scheme wouldn't have gone through. But she died in 1937, which worked perfectly for Alice. So
yeah, so that's why you've set it in 38. Yeah. And it's just to tell the readers a little bit more about it. Ellis finds a letter which was written by Florence, which was referring to the possibility of a lost Bram Stoker manuscript, that her husband claimed that he'd burnt it, but that she thought that this would not have been in keeping with his character. And so Ellis is very excited about this, obviously, and he goes to the Lyceum Theatre where Stoker worked, and he does his rooting around, and there's all these old chairs and bits of furniture and everything, and he's searching through everything, and then he finds a single first chapter of the Undead Count, and he decides, well, what if I were just to forge the rest of this novel and present it as this lost manuscript? This would be my way of making my fortune.
I mean, he's written the first chapter as well, and he sets himself up to find it. So what he's actually doing is he needs to believe in it so authentically himself that he plants it there. So he finds it himself that way and can pass it off, just so that he can completely believe the fiction within the fiction.
Yeah. Wow, it's so interesting, because I mean, and again, it's something that the three novels here have in common. The frustrated artist. So we did mention before the fact that Ellis is a frustrated writer, that he doesn't feel he's getting the recognition that he deserves, that nobody is recognizing his brilliance. He obviously feels that he identifies with Bram Stoker, because Stoker was not recognized in his lifetime either. As you just said there, Henrietta, it was Florence's work after his death that really brought him into the public eye. So we have this frustrated character in each of these pieces. In your novel, Neil, it's John who's a frustrated artist. Al and Laura can't get an acting job. So we're suddenly presented with all of these frustrated artistic types. Do you think that's a coincidence, guys? Or is this reflecting our own reality as frustrated artists? Henrietta, I'm going to throw that one to you again.
Actually, I think there is an element of me reflecting on writing in it, because in a lot of ways, A Talented Man is a book about writing, and a book about how do you create things and how do you make something out of nothing and what is the value if you make something out of other people's nothing and try and make something of it of your own. So absolutely, there was definitely a lot of me thinking through what writing means and why do it at all to begin with. Why try and create something supposedly original to begin with? Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. And Neil, just I've mentioned the characters that are in the books, but actually you began there with your prologue with Emily Sanborn, who herself was also an artist who failed to be recognised during her lifetime. Now, she is a fictional artist. I was wondering, actually, when I started reading The Jewel, I thought, did this lady exist? And I had to go and check because she was so believable. So we've got that element there as well. And it's interesting that's kind of your kicking off point, Neil, with this frustrated artist.
Yeah, I was very keen to channel, I suppose is the best word, the idea of the artist who simply doesn't get the recognition he or she deserves. In this case, it's she. And I know a little bit about Victorian writing. I didn't at that time know very much about Victorian painting, but I knew enough to know that characters like Emily Sanborn were and indeed are legion, that they simply don't get the oxygen, they don't get the affirmation, they don't get the attention. In her case, simply because of her gender. It doesn't matter how talented she was. It doesn't matter anything about the body of work that she puts together in the course of her life. She never will be taken for granted, or she never will get any affirmation. And I wanted to show that eventually, sometimes people do, so that it took a long time for her. But at the moment that The Jewel, her last painting, is stolen in this heist, it's one of the most celebrated paintings in the world. Now there's a kind of a difficulty there too. She wanted her last work to be taken to the grave with her. She had just had enough. It was going to be hers. She wasn't interested anymore in this struggle. But that last wish of hers gets taken away from her too. Her descendants go, no, hang on a second, I think there's something here. There might be some money here. She can't control all these things. But there is some kind of comfort, I hope, for the reader in reflecting on the fact that sometimes fame, if you want to call it that, sometimes affirmation, creative affirmation will come. Sometimes talent will be recognized, even if it's decades or a century later. And I like that idea of the voiceless, of lost histories being reclaimed, because it doesn't happen very often, and it's great when it does.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Neil. Yeah. And I was reading a review there, Alan, of Laura Cassidy's Walk of Fame earlier from the Indo, and the heading, they had a damaged young woman unravels in the search for fame, which I would say would be quite a superficial reading of what your novel is about, because I think it's about so much more than that. It's much more about Laura trying to deal with her father's death. But it seems, you know, from what you read earlier, Alan, just the pressure that her father was unknowingly putting her under in order to achieve this as well, I think has damaged her in many ways.
Yeah, I think she does get locked into something there really early in life. But she's, if you like, accepted these terms, and she's going to go with it. And sometimes, you know, that question that's always guaranteed to elicit instant tears from a writer, you know, what's it about? And And I think, yeah, the book itself, I mean, I think it's I change sometimes the adjective. I think it's a comedy of aspiration, but pitted against unusual levels of blind optimism and hope. And the hope is self-sabotaging, you know. And I think the when we meet Laura, I mean, she is certain in her belief that she has what it takes to go all the way. Um, she's gonna, get to the West End in London. She's gonna get to Broadway in New York. She's gonna get over to Tinseltown in Hollywood, all the way to the extent that she's gonna have her name etched into this so-called Boulevard, this Hollywood Walk of Fame, and that's it. That's her forever, immortality, just like her daddy tells her in the opening salvo. And and as is the way, so off she goes in pursuit of this dream. We've set her on a journey, and she's looking for something, she's chasing something, and as is the way of journeys, it's quickly going to proceed in pretty much every direction other than the one it perhaps should. And all these things that are simmering inside Laura from this subsequent early tragedy, they're going to flare up, manifest themselves in a way that she cannot foresee, and they're really going to hamper her way through life.
Yeah.
And what I think she's done, and it again harps back to that gap. There's a huge gap between where she is when we meet her and where she wants to be. And this place, it becomes a place of invention and dream and imagination, and its people do it, secret people and secret friends and invented places and imagined places. And these become, if you like, her refuge, and a way for her to enter into the days of her life, and they provide a way for her, into the world and to get through the world. And unfortunately, it's also a place where the flip side of that, desperation, disappointment, frustration, setback, all those elements that often feature prevalently in an artist's life. I mean, let's face it, it's a flip-flop thing they have all signed up for. And I think these are the conditions that she is less able to cope with, and is possibly aware that will ultimately cause her a lot of harm, and potentially send her to a very, very, very dark place, and a place that she is not equipped at all to handle.
Okay, well, that seems a very good note to end on. I'm getting the flag waved at me by our technical team here. So we're ending on Alan's note that it's a flip-flop thing we're all dealing with here in creativity. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining me this afternoon, Henrietta McKervey, Neil Hegarty, and Alan McMonagle. For our viewers, our next event coming up this evening is the short story panel, which is moderated by Edward O'Dwyer and features Mary Morrissey, Madeline Darcy, and Tig Coakley. And that event will be happening here on YouTube at 5:30. So thank you very much for joining us this afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you to our three writers.
Thanks.